I speak to you in the name of one God, holy and undivided Trinity. Love is a word that gets thrown around a lot. It is one of the most powerful words in the English language, and it is certainly one of the most difficult words to truly understand in the sense of putting flesh on it. Today, we hear Jesus talking a lot about love, even commanding us to love one another, which frankly strikes me as a little difficult, if not flat out impossible. How can you command someone to love someone else? It reminds me of when I was a little girl and my mother would sort of command me to love my sisters and treat them well. We would glare at each other, secure in the knowledge that loving someone because you were supposed to was a ridiculous idea. A lot of languages have many words for love. There's a lot of nuance in them, but English is quite stunted in this area. So we use the word love to apply to a wide variety of things, like, I love ice cream. Or we think it's something we feel for those we are really close to, but not anyone else. Or we think it is all about a warm, fuzzy feeling or about romance. But love, as anyone who has ever been in a relationship with another actual human being knows, is not sentimental. It is not always warm and fuzzy, and sometimes it is downright difficult. The Reverend Michael Gemignani writes movingly of his wife Nilda's journey with Alzheimer's and her ultimate death from that horrible disease. Life, he writes, is a school to learn how to love. When we marry someone, we think we are doing so because we love that person. But it is not when we are married that we learn to love, but during the course of the marriage. When Nilda first realized she was losing control of her mind, she lashed out, became angry, and I was the target of most of her anger because I was close at hand. And I myself became angry because this was not the way life was supposed to be, because of the serious inconvenience Nilda's odd behavior was causing me. There were times when I cried, he writes. One time was when I told her it was our anniversary and we had been married 25 years. Her response, delivered so innocently, was, "Are we married?" Felt crushing, and I left her room and wept. Gemignani goes on to talk about his slow realization that in taking care of his wife as she slowly lost herself, he was beginning to understand what love truly is. He was understanding in a new way what the vow he had made 25 years prior meant. He writes, "She was dying mentally and physically. I was dying to self in a deep spiritual sense. I was giving up what I wanted for what she needed and for what I had come to realize love demanded. I was giving up control of my life in the name of love." Life, he writes, is a school to learn how to love creation, one another, ourselves, and most of all, God. There are times when life presents us with choices that force us to decide what our real priorities are. Choices that require us to decide what love means and what love requires of us. Despite what our culture tells us, love does not make its primary home in our emotions, but in the choices we make and why we make them. Choices we make every day about whether or not we will live lives grounded in love. Jesus got this. And in the passage from John, right after the one we heard this morning, where he spoke to his friends about love, he picked up their feet and washed them. And this is where we too need to begin if we are to love as Jesus loved, not as the washer, but rather as the washee. Paradoxically, we begin by allowing ourselves to be served, by accepting that Jesus kneels at our feet and stretches out his hands to wash our feet, not just those of others, but ours, warts, calluses, and all. We begin by acknowledging that we are in desperate need of that holy touch, of that cleansing and that connection. And in doing so, acknowledging that we are imperfect, that despite telling ourselves that we're pretty fabulous and having a lot invested in looking like we have it all together, we recognize that we are flawed and therefore will inevitably fall short in our attempts to love one another. That we will take our place in that huge company who have really intended to love others as Jesus did, but could not quite see it through when the cost became apparent. Like Peter, who I have to think really meant it when he said, "I will lay down my life for you," and then moments later was loudly protesting he had no idea who Jesus even was. We know that there will be times in our lives that our fear overwhelms our desire to love. And of course, if we are to love as Jesus did, we are to serve, to willingly accept the not-so-starring role of servant. We have to kneel down in the dust and dirt and pick up feet that have been God knows where and walk through God knows what and cradle them in our hands, washing off the dirt, offering comfort and care. And perhaps even harder than serving, if we are to love as Christ loves, we are to let go of our pettiness, our grudges, our prejudices, our righteous indignation and anger. Rather than loving with our fingers crossed behind our back, loving those who love us, but protesting that surely we don't have to love those who may have hurt us, or those who have the wrong ideas and wrong beliefs. Rather than that, we are called to love all people, all, not even one exception. Commandment in Latin is mandatum, something that is mandatory. Jesus was not saying to his friends, "Hey guys, I have this great idea. What do you think of this?" Nor was he saying, "Hey, here's a suggestion you might want to form a committee and think about, because I won't be around much longer." What Jesus commands is love. It's the bottom line for discipleship. It is the mark of those who follow Jesus. And to be honest, that is one heck of a tough bottom line to walk as individuals and as communities. Our inclination is to separate people into good and bad, acceptable and unacceptable categories. Our inclination is to be tribal, setting clear boundaries and keeping the banquet table small enough that only those we want seated are at the table with us. And churches, my friends, have been among the worst offenders, declaring all sorts of people to be outside of God's love and outside of the community. In other words, blatantly violating the commandment Jesus gave us as his last will and testament, to love one another. No asterisk. No, unless they turn out to be, fill in the blank. But to love one another, to keep making the table larger and larger, seating all who walk in the door and roaming the streets to find folks and invite them in for a meal, to look for those on the margins specifically and embrace them with love. Real love, the kind of love Jesus is talking about, is about annoying the powerful, not about being polite. It is not about getting a nice, warm feeling, nor about avoiding uncomfortable truths in ourselves and in others. It is about the difficult, nearly impossible task of seeing and respecting the dignity of every human being. It is about serving others, recognizing that while we may not particularly like one another at times, we are called always to respect and treat each other with dignity and to work for justice, especially those who are on the margins and those we don't like. It is about struggling through life in community, life with people we do not always get along with, and yet choose to be with, because in the struggle, in the relationships, we see the face of God. Love for Jesus is not a word or a feeling at all. It is a stance toward the world, an action, an ongoing choice, an action that for him meant willingness to endure even death rather than abandon God's love and God's desire for justice. Disciples are to do love, not think love, say love, have faith in love, or even believe that God is love. Disciples are to bring love to life by giving it our own flesh, by putting it into practice. Do love, Jesus says, and you will live. If you want to know who my followers are, Jesus says, look at what they do. Look at how they treat one another and the world. Look at how they are in the world, at the shape their life takes. Don't look for the cross on the top of the building or the cross worn around the neck. Look for the one kneeling in the dust, cradling a dirty foot. Look for the one struggling through the difficult and painful work of reconciliation with another. Look for the one taking risk, protesting injustice and working for justice. Look, Jesus says, for the one willing to love as I have loved, in a way that has no limits, and there you will find me. May it be so.